Hello, Roz. How are you?
Hello, Jane.
Great to see you.
Knowing who you are and where you're from and your beginnings is the only way you can find out where you're going or who and what you can become. I was born in 1953 and in those days there weren't many black people around in London at all. When my mother got pregnant, I think it caused consternation and somewhat of a scandal in the neighbourhood because she was from a white working class background in South London, in Battersea, and I think for a start she was an unmarried mother, which in itself was quite a stigma in those days, but also it became apparent that the father was likely to be African. So my grandmother in particular was very worried about this, and she was worried about what the neighbours would say. So my mother was asked to leave and she found a place in an unmarried mother's home. And so she was all on her own, 19 years of age with a little black baby. It was just amazing that she was so brave, really. And she wouldn't give me up at all. I asked her how she felt at that time, and she said she felt very elated that she'd had a baby and all on her own, and that she was managing to cope, and that she had kept me. On the whole, your chances of being adopted, if you were, you know, disabled or you were mixed race, were unlikely, really.
So you would have finished up in care, in an orphanage.
Yeah, in a life of care. And I think my mum knew that, and that's all the more reason why she wanted to keep me, which was quite incredible, really, for that kind of situation. And after 6 more weeks in the unmarried mother's home, that was the limit. And after that, you had to get a place in a hostel. When my grandfather came to visit her, and apparently he looked in the cot and he said, "Let's have her home." So we went back to Battersea, and I spent most of my early childhood there. People knew the family and knew the background of the family. And so I went into a very sort of close-knit community on this working class estate. So I think although I was a strange-looking kid, and I knew that, and I was very clear about that, and particularly when I went out of my neighbourhood. So I knew I was different, but I don't think I had experienced out-and-out racism until I moved to Surbiton when my mum got married. And there I attended a church school, and there was one particular little red-headed boy. I'll remember him to this day. I think he wanted to maybe distract attention from his own difference, and he kept up a barrage of insults, you know, calling me woggy and saying I've been rolling in dog shit and so on. And I really got very upset about this. So eventually I did complain to the teacher, and the teacher said in front of myself and him and his friends, to me, you shouldn't complain about it because it'll only make it worse. You just encourage him, just ignore it. And so I really felt then that nobody was going to stick up for me. People kept on asking me, who's your father, where are you from, why are you a different colour from the rest of your family? So in the end, I wrote my first and only play at the age of 8.
How amazing.
Yeah, it was called Why I Am Brown. And the teacher actually said that I could perform it in front of the whole class. And I think after that it really increased understanding among my peers about my background. If you tell your story, then you're more likely to get recognition and understanding, although it did make me realise even at that age that I had very little information about my background. Because I really didn't know anything about my father. He knew of my existence, but he didn't actually see me. And then he went back to Ghana because he was a student.
And you knew he was Ghanaian?
Yes, I knew he was Ghanaian, and I knew he'd gone back very shortly after I was born.
Did you mind that as you grew into your teens?
I did mind it, and I did ask my mother a lot of questions, but I think she was quite reticent to talk about it, as you can imagine. I mean, you know, she's been left with a very challenging situation, and I think she found it painful to think about it and talk about it. I also think she really honestly didn't know very much about my father either. It was a very short relationship. And so she, you know, as an unmarried mother, that was already a stigma anyway. But to have a black child, I think, in those days was quite difficult. So I think she felt abandoned, really. And I understood that. But at the same time, I really wanted to know about my own story. We moved to Stafford after Surbiton, which I think it was probably about the only Midlands town in the 60s that didn't have an ethnic minority population growing. So I still felt very alone and also very visible. So by this time now, this was the third or fourth school that I'd been to where I was the only black girl in the school. And so it became sort of habitual that I was moving around and all the time having to explain myself. I think if I'd stayed in one neighbourhood, people just get used to you and they know who you are. But I was constantly having to explain myself with very little information. And it's a bit like a sculptor, I suppose, having an idea, you know, not having half the material to form your identity, really. You haven't got the material to build an identity. And that became more and more acute as I went through my adolescence.
So if I've got this right, it must have been 1971 when you went up to university, right at the start of the revival of the women's movement.
Yes, that's right. And I think the women's movement was a fantastic inspiration to me at that time because it was just all starting and we were making up new words, new concepts. It was a completely open field, and at the same time it gave me a sense of identity as a woman that I'd never had before.
So you became very active in the student union and made a speech about sexism and the behaviour of the rugby club.
Yes, people said, "Oh, I bet you're going to be the next. You know, you'll be in Parliament." And I did stand for president of the Students' Union. I was in the Students' Union with mostly males. Very few women got involved, and I thought I ought to stand as a candidate because we should have women in the Students' Union, and I got elected, and I think in a way I cut my teeth on the women's movement, which was all about evolving things and all about not sticking for what is but understanding the way the world could be different.
Because you now got this feminist identity, had you forgotten about the issue of, you know, being black?
Well, one of my biggest heroines was Angela Davis, of course.
Right.
And when I was au pairing in Finland, I can remember it was 1970 then, and Angela Davis was really shot to fame, and she'd been in prison for her beliefs and so on. And I can remember in Finland, people were running up to me and saying, "Free Angela Davis!" And we can't understand why people your colour should be locked up in prison, because I think they assumed I came from the States. Yeah, because I had the big afro hairdo, and very much modelled my style on her. I think that I was really looking for a community to belong in, and I can remember when I was at Leicester, my boyfriend, when I was 21, he took me down to Belgrave Road, which is where all the sari shops are and the Indian shops are, to buy me a sari. And I used to wear this sari to all the formal occasions. In fact, there's an oil painting of me done by one of the people in the Students' Union wearing this sari. And I realised that it wasn't just the clothes that I really loved. It was also just hanging out with a few brown people. I really needed that, even though it was completely, I was as unconnected to them as anybody else, but at the same time I just felt less conspicuous. And I thought, maybe if I go to Africa, I will find a sense of who I am. I believe I was one of the very first volunteers of African descent to go on BSO. And I was really excited to be posted in Tanzania because it was a country at that time with a socialist government and a very charismatic, famous world leader, President Nyerere, who I really admired tremendously and who I actually met while I was there. And I made a lot of friends and became very fond of some of the students that I taught. And it was obviously a transformational experience, and it gave me a real lifelong passion for development issues. But I also think it threw up for me quite unexpected issues around my identity. And being one of the very first black volunteers, I think I was quite unprepared to deal with it. A certain amount of intolerance of mixed race people, and I can remember organising a debating society evening at the school where I was teaching near Iringa. And one of the students stood up in front of the whole school and argued that mixed race people were generally kind of weaker, less intelligent, unnatural, and shouldn't be allowed. I also experienced some harassment at school from one teacher who said, I don't like these black people with white passports. And I had a number of those kind of experiences that I found really difficult to cope with, and I had no one to talk to about them. And I think I felt more confused than ever about my identity. I came back to England and I started working with an organisation to do with education. So I was still working in the students' movement, and I was also working on development issues. And of course, one of the most important things to me throughout the 70s and 80s was my involvement in the anti-apartheid movement. And I think that helped me to find a space where I could make more sense of my identity, as well as being part of an international solidarity movement for racial justice. So I think actually that meant as much to me as being engaged in the women's movement at that time.
Had you stopped worrying about your paternity?
I was really excited about my life, but I got to a point, I think it was partly prompted by a relationship breakup, where I really felt that I needed to know who I was and became obsessed with trying to find my father. And I started to feel that it could be too late as well. And I wanted, above all, to be able to say to my own children who their grandfather was. So I realised that I just needed to know my story. And as I was moving around in the world, of course, people would ask me all the time. Suddenly get a phone call in the middle of the week. I was at work working for the National Alliance of Women's Organisations. I got a phone call from my friend Efwa, who said, I know who your father is, I found him. And she said, yes, I met an old friend of mine who is the same age as your father would have been, who is visiting friends in Manchester at the moment, and I know he was at university in London around the same time as your dad, and I just happened to mention his name. And he said, of course I knew John Cujo. He said to Effa, please ask Jane to get in touch with me and I'll tell her all about her dad. And I was so amazed by this. And I rang him up and spoke to him, and he was saying, why have you left it all this long time? Your dad will be waiting for you. And I said, well, he left my mum and he's never been in touch. And he said, yes, but he'll be waiting for you. No Ghanaian parent would ever reject their child. And we need to follow some protocols here because he's now a very eminent chief, and he's also a member of the Council of State.
So, you flew to Ghana, where he had arranged for an intermediary, Mrs. Kwakwa, to meet you. And after a couple of days, she took you to this large house.
An enormous place, and there was a man sitting on the veranda with two women next to him. I looked at this man who was sitting there and I thought, that's him. That is definitely him. I'd never seen him before. I'd never seen a photo of him, but his face looked so familiar. My face reflected back to me. He's so regal and good looking and attractive. And there was a conversation going on between him and Mrs. Kwakwa in Fanti. I said to Mrs. Kwakwa, can you translate this for me, please? I don't know what's going on. And she said, well, Jane, you have been wanting to meet this man all your life. This is John Cujo. What have you got to say to him? And I was just speechless. I hadn't prepared for it for once. I had absolutely no idea what to say. So I came out with a total cliche. I said, he said to me, what's your name? And I said, I'm Jane Goldsmith. I believe you knew my mother. And he said, oh, yes, I knew your mum, Olive. And you're my daughter. Welcome home. And he just stood up and embraced me. And then the woman next to him stood up and said, I'm his wife, and you must call me mother. I had no idea of your existence, otherwise I would have called for you sooner, because I've always wanted a daughter. And she put her arms around me and she said, you must come and stay with us and call us mum and dad. So I was in floods of tears, and I remember her putting her arms around me and saying, it's not your fault. Which was a great thing to say, actually. Because I think you tend to think it is your fault. It's my fault I'm in this situation. It's my fault I can't care about it. I can't deal with it. It's my fault that I think so much about it and haven't learned to accommodate it. And live with it, and live within my own skin.
And somehow she'd understood all that.
Yes, she had. She was a very wise woman, I thought. And also, I thought so incredibly magnanimous to, a child rolls up and, you don't even know that she exists. And immediately her instinct was to say, you're my daughter. My father passed away in 1998, so I only knew him for 8 years. But I'm in touch with my village. I've become Queen of Development of my village. I was crowned Queen of Development after my dad died. He was chief of that village, and they've asked me to come back and help the village. And I now got a status and a connection with that village of my own.
Why are you so passionate about telling this story, Jane?
The things about telling your own story is how difficult it is, and how the more complex it is and the more it involves other people's secrets and things they don't want to face or talk about, the more it is difficult to untangle it from your own story. In a sense, we're all a whole lot of joined up stories. So in order to tell your own story, you have to tell your mother's story, your father's story, your friends' stories, and so on. As a child, you get this understanding that there are no-go areas. And if this very much involves your own identity, it gets confused with it. So I was always afraid, actually. I was always afraid to say what had happened to me, in case anybody felt to blame for it, or upset about it, or sad that they couldn't protect me from it. So in a way, I think in telling my own story, I'm claiming people's right to tell their story and to own it, and to feel that they don't have to edit bits out. It's all about having a personal geography and a personal history and a language to describe it. And once you have those things in place, it's possible to challenge, to know which bits you want to enhance, where to find out more, and so on. But if you have several of those pieces missing in a society which takes visible difference very seriously, then I think you're at a huge disadvantage. So I sort of had multiple disadvantages, really. In the 70s, in the Black Power movement and so on, people were very black and white, and you identified as black. So as far as possible, pushing your white heritage, if you were a mixed race person, to one side. And the interesting thing is that I knew a lot about my white heritage, and it was a white working class heritage, which I was very proud of, and very left wing. And my mother was very brave, and a very brave feminist at a time when it wasn't fashionable. So I had a lot of pride in that side of my family. But that was the side that in some ways, as a black person, I was not able to reflect. Whereas the other part of my heritage, I knew nothing about. So it was very difficult to explain my black identity to people and to join in conversations about heritage and so on. So I felt at a big disadvantage. There were assumptions made about me and who I was and what sort of person I was at every turn. And it's not so much who do you think you are as who do other people think I am. So I was constantly being mistaken for something else. And so I just felt that if I had control of that and I was able to tell my own story. At the same time, I think it's so important for other people to tell their stories, because when I tell my story, people have all sorts of resonance about times that they felt they were different, or times when they, especially for mixed race people, when they felt that they had to choose and they were constantly having to almost defend their right to exist. Even beyond that, I think we need to think about the diversity of human beings. Why should anybody be put in a box? Everybody's got an interesting story to tell. We have to be brave in telling that story and give ourselves permission to do it. And you do, as I realised when I was 8, things can change. Things do change.